Okay, thank you all for being here all the way till the end. And I think we've saved, one of the most influential speakers that we have today is our keynote address by Mark Tessler. Mark Tessler is the Samuel Eldersveld Collegiate Professor of Politics at the University of Michigan. Among the 16 books he has authored, co-authored, or edited are Public Opinion in the Middle East, Survey Research and the Political Orientations of Ordinary Citizens and Social Science Research, and Social Science Research in the Arab World and Beyond, a guide for students, instructors, and researchers. He is the co-founder and co-director of the Arab Barometer Public Opinion Research Project. Professor Tessler has also written extensively on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and today he'll be talking about measuring variables pertaining to Islam in individual level studies. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. So people can hear this, right?
Yep.
Excellent. And for changing, this is just.
So press this one here. Yep, exactly.
Okay. Go back.
Yes, you're gonna be there. Over here. Oh no, sorry.
I'm sure I'm going to have trouble with this. Well, I'm very glad to be here, and it's been, I'm sure, a long program. I was planning to come in last night, so I could have been part of the whole conference, but of course, you all know what the weather did. I wasn't really sure what to do with this presentation. And like Russell's and some of the others, it's not about a particular research project where I've got some propositions, I have some data, I test them, and we kind of try to figure out what that all means. So what I've decided to do, but you can give me some guidance as I go through this, talk about different measurement issues, different kinds of measurement issues that I've confronted and what I've done in various studies. I'll make reference to some of the studies. If you want, we can talk about those studies in more detail. But I'm just going to kind of mention them in the context of measurement issues. And these are the issues that I'll be talking about, starting with dimensionality, and you can read them and you'll see them as we go along. So first, I just want to introduce the Arab Barometer. Probably most of you know about it, or many of you know about it, and I don't need to talk about it a long time. But we have finished 7 waves now. We are working on the survey instrument for wave 8. It's being circulated among ourselves and all of our partners to give some comments on new questions to add, questions that were asked in the past that maybe turned out not to be so helpful. We should remove some of those questions. And so I just want, and not all, but the majority of the projects that I'm going to talk about use Arab Barometer data. There's an important exception that I'll talk about when I get there. If you happen not to be aware of it and are interested, there is an online analysis tool. Are people familiar with that at all? Or maybe not, or some are? Okay, good. So I want to say the data are downloadable in various different formats for no charge. Our first wave, we put a 2-year embargo on it, telling ourselves, as is often the case, well, we'll need a little time to kind of do our own analysis of the data. 2 years passed, we hadn't really done very much, and we figured, no, this is not the right way. And so since the first wave, there have been, takes a little while to clean them when they come in, and then they're immediately available. And for those who want to not download the data, that's just not what you want to do, or maybe you don't have the software, you can go fairly far, at least through bivariate analysis, and maybe even a little bit more than that, online, just by logging into our online analysis tool. So this is a book that Russell mentioned, and I want to highlight it a bit. I've just finished up, along with Amani Jamal. Maybe she talked about this, I don't know. We had a Carnegie project, and we were asked to, were invited to identify young Arab professionals. Mostly they were young faculty professors, but some were in other kinds of institutions, and to run a series of workshops for them. Mostly it was, I mean, the name was kind of capacity building, but many of the people were well trained. We weren't there to teach them things they didn't know, but to give them an opportunity to together with one another and to develop a publishable paper at the end of these 2 years. The last half year, and the events that were supposed to take place then were done virtually, as I'm sure you can appreciate. But there was one other element of the grant that was important. We committed ourselves to developing something that in the original proposal we called a curriculum. And we didn't exactly know what that meant. It meant some sort of document that would be useful for instructional purposes. So I took it upon myself as time went on to put this in the form of a book, and took about 2 years. I had input from a number of people, and the result is Social Science Research in the Arab World, a guide for students, instructors, and researchers. It's about 180 pages. It goes through, you can see from the table of contents, there's some stuff at the beginning that tells why we're doing this, where it came from, what do we mean when we say it's targeted for the Arab world, and come back to some of those themes at the end. But the contents are univariate, bivariate, and multivariate analysis. And we think and hope it will be useful. Also, there are appendices that have a lot of specific information as well. There were two things that I felt were, my goodness. Yeah, sorry. One more. And I'm sure I'm going to have trouble with this as we go along. But there were two things I really wanted. We had a little bit of money for this in the grant. One was that it be available without charge. That we have it open access, it be available, and people can download it without charge. I haven't looked in the last week or so, but it was published in really October, so it's been a little less than 4 months. And last time I looked, there were about 4,500 downloads. So this is very nice, and we hope people will use it. We worked out arrangements with the publisher. I won't go into the details, but it is available for downloading online at free of charge. Second thing we wanted was that it should be available in Arabic. There are a lot of places in the Arab world where it would be useful for instructional purposes and useful in English, but it ought to be available in Arabic as well. There are many places that wouldn't be valuable if it weren't in Arabic. We've been fortunate, I should say, I've been fortunate. Qatar University Press, coming back to Qatar, has agreed to translate it and publish it online, open access, free of charge as well. It's supposed to be out at the end of this month. And so if there aren't any delays, it'll be within a week, it'll be out. My guess is it might take a little bit longer than that. The translator, I'll go back to my main theme. I'll tell you more about the book and sort of how we approached all this and what the translation is all about and who did the translation later on, if interested. Okay, so now I went the wrong way, and I don't know. Okay, so now I'm talking about constructing measures when you have a lot of different items. And there's an article that came out of this. The reference is down at the bottom. I did it with one of our graduate students. I'm focusing on some hypotheses involving personal religiosity. Because that's kind of consistent with the theme here. That's not the main focus of the article, but it's maybe useful here. And so there's some hypotheses. Men and women who are more religious are more likely to, and the dependent variable is support for or attitude toward gender equality. You can probably see it better than I can. One of the hypotheses, if people who are more religious are less supportive of gender equality. Well, why would that be the case? Is that a plausible hypothesis? Maybe, maybe not. If it's worth testing, it ought to have a causal story that we think is at least interesting and plausible. And if it turns out that the hypothesis is not confirmed, well, that's why we tested the hypothesis, to know that this is not the case. But the question I want to ask here is, which of these items should we use? Should we use all of them? Should we use a particular subset? How do we make that decision? I'm going to be using a new data set for this, not the Arab barometer. And this is the one time it won't be. And I'll mention on the next slide what that new data set is. Anybody want to make a prediction? Do you think the hypothesis, and we have H1A and H1B, that maybe actually being more religious makes you more supportive? And there's a logical reason why that might be the case. Certainly there are people who will argue that the notion that Islam is opposed to gender equality is to misinterpret Islam. And maybe people who are more religious are better able to know that that's a misinterpretation. And so maybe more religious people will actually be more supportive, even though probably if you ask people just ordinarily, they might say no. So anybody want to make a prediction? Which one of these hypotheses was confirmed, or were they both not confirmed? Okay, well, I can tell you, and maybe it'll be kind of, a little bit. So what we found was that men and women who are more religious are less supportive of gender equality, but that's only the case for older people. We looked at a bunch of different subcategories, no difference for men and women in that respect, no difference in terms of religiosity having impact, no difference for men and women, no difference associated with education. But among older people, both men and women, and even some who were educated, they tended to say, so there is a finding, and I think it's kind of interesting, and it's not, and it's that sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't make a difference, and we can say something about what do you mean when you say sometimes? Well, sometimes the people are older. So what we did here, and I'll come to this in the next slide in a minute, we use factor analysis. People are familiar with factor analysis, or not so much, or yes, okay. And that gave us a chance to decide which items belong together and which items don't. So this is a different project, and this is one I'm working on now. Maybe people with one of my students, and maybe people will have some ideas. Again, I'm looking at religiosity and political Islam for purposes of the conference. It's about measured Muslim public. So the paper itself is going to go in a slightly different direction. But the dependent variable, on which we have good data from the Arab barometer, is sexual harassment. And people were asked to what extent have they experienced physical sexual harassment and verbal sexual harassment, and they could answer according to a scale. And we can, for each individual in the survey, and we're working in a number of different countries. For this project, I think we're working on 5, if I remember right. The person can be very much exposed and has been a victim of this, and other people can be no. So that's the variance to be explained. We have a bunch of different, so here I've put in a lot of potentially relevant questions pertaining to personal religiosity. It's very vague on my screen, I can't even read them, but I know they're up there. And also a bunch of questions pertaining to political Islam. And it might be possible that these two dimensions are really very closely related. And it's only in my conceptualization, my inaccurate conceptualization, that I'm thinking support for political Islam and personal religiosity are different things. But maybe in fact they'll all load highly on one factor. So what the purpose here is to sort out the dimensionality of these items, which items belong together and which items don't, which items belong together but not with something else. And the solution we see here is 2 variables. It comes out very neatly. I should probably stand here so I can actually see the. And so all the questions that we might think have something to do with personal religiosity go together, with one sort of exception, which is Friday prayer. And all the questions that we might think have to do with political support or opposition to attitudes toward political Islam, they go together. It's interesting that the question about attendance at Friday prayer doesn't work, and so it's kind of what factor analysis tells us. It tells us what are the clusters of items that we have, And we have, I think, 5 items that seem to measure personal religiosity. And we could have had an argument before doing this. Well, why did you include this question on Fajr time, morning prayer, prayer at dawn? And you know, maybe it doesn't belong, or maybe it does belong. Well, we're gonna take a look and see if it belongs. And yes, it goes very well. It goes strongly with a factor that other items go with. And the same thing for political Islam. So it sorts out the dimensionality, which clusters which items belong together in a cluster, and then all these items they've been demonstrated to be reliable. If you understand what reliability is, this is evidence that they're reliable, and they have face validity. I mean, I think to the extent that we might argue, well, you know, what exactly does it measure? Is it a valid measure? Does it really measure what you're trying to measure? And I would say, well, that's a fair question, but I think I can say probably it does, because all the other items that seem to have got the same thing correlate with it or load on the same factor. So I took the items that were on one of the factors, on personal religiosity, for example, and ran them separately on analysis. That one item that didn't seem to fit, as we expect, still doesn't fit. And I have 4 remaining items that are pretty good, and I can do any one of a number of things with them. I could take one of the items by itself. Whether that's going to capture enough variance will depend on the item, but we can proceed on the assumption that it's valid and reliable. Or I can add them together in a scale, a kind of additive index. And those who know factor analysis know that we can do factor scores, which will combine them together, will give us a collective measure with each item weighted according to its importance on that factor. This was just an opportunity to address the question, you know, how should it proceed if I put a lot of questions on a questionnaire? I put them in because I think they're good questions, but can I be sure they're good questions? And should I use all of them? Should I use some of them? If only some of them, which one should I use? Well, there are other ways to approach this as well, but factor analysis does this job very well. And it also brings, as I was saying, evidence of reliability and a very strong case for inferring validity. This is the new data set that I was mentioning. It's a little bit old now. There are 2 things that are up here. They both have to do with a different Carnegie grant, not the one I was talking about earlier that led to the book, but a grant for doing some research on how and why people think about support for political Islam. And of course, I used as a foundation Arab barometer data, but I had a lot of other data as well. And so I built this rather elaborate data set, which is available through the what we call the consortium, ICPSR at Michigan. Anybody who wants it can have it. There are, I think 50, probably on here somewhere, 54 surveys in there. Use all the Arab barometer surveys. I use the world values survey that have been done in Arab countries. I used a bunch of other surveys that I had done, or in one case, one of my students had done. And so it's a pretty big data set. I've updated it once. It was originally, we put it in 2014. I updated it with new Arab barometer data. So if you want a comprehensive data set, it's available for use. And one other thing about this, instead I had what they call, I guess, an Islamic scholar grant from Carnegie that just comes to an individual. And I used the funds to, in part, among other things, to construct this data set. It's called here, Carnegie Middle East Governance and Islam Data Set. And then the dates that are covered. The earliest surveys go back to 1988, and the latter ones, most recent that are put in when I did this, were 2016. A book came out of it as well. You see the cover and the title of the book down here, Islam and Politics in the Middle East, explaining the views of ordinary citizens. The question that I faced here was question of the conceptual equivalence. So if I wanted to rate each respondent, there are all these surveys together. I can't remember exactly the end, but it's less than 100,000, but it's probably over 80,000. So there are a lot of respondents. And I would like to, oh, one other thing about the data set I should mention, in case you are interested in taking a look, it not only has all of these surveys integrated and merged with whatever is necessary to make sure that different surveys have the same numbers. So when you're comparing question 13, you're getting the same thing regardless of which which one you're looking at. We also have a lot of country level variables. There are about 30 different country level variables. At the time of the survey, what was the GNP of the country? At the time of the survey, what was its polity score on the civil rights or index? So you can do two-level analysis quite nicely. You can do the individual, and then you can see whether relationships at the individual level are or are not associated with certain system level or country level attributes. What I put this up here for our purposes, however, was what to do, how to establish measures that were conceptually equivalent if the same questions weren't asked in every survey. If I've got, and here are the questions they're playing around with. Well, you can read them probably better than I can. Government should implement not only the laws of the laws of the Sharia. What you have is how many of the different surveys had this particular question. There's no question that every survey had, but there are a lot of surveys, 83.7%, that had similar questions. And so the question was kind of like before, factor analysis, combining items to make a measure that is unidimensional and the basis for addressing validity and reliability concerns. But it isn't necessarily the same question in every case. So what I did here, actually went to the right place, was to look at what I'm calling bridging items. And the logic is written out here down at the bottom. The factor, including number 4, which is religious and private matters should be separated from political life. If that loads highly on a factor and helps us understand what that factor measures, and then in another survey, say Algeria 2004, that item also loads highly on a survey that has other questions that appear to be about the political role of Islam in national life. I think we're arguing, or I was arguing, that the two measures are conceptually equivalent. Each one appears to be measuring attitude toward political Islam. There is an item in each of the surveys that loads very highly on that cluster or on that factor. And so it's reasonable to argue that a factor based on items 2, 3, and 4, and maybe 5, although that's a little bit weak, the factor that combines those items, and maybe in factor scores, that what that measures is conceptually equivalent to what items 1, 4, and 6 measure in Algeria in 2004. I think I've explained that clearly. I'm not 100% sure that I have, but the goal is to be able to, if I want to test hypotheses about that a particular independent variable, let's say low socioeconomic status, or we'll just say low socioeconomic status. If I have the hypothesis that low socioeconomic status predicts to or pushes toward support for political Islam, and it could be a much larger causal story, but just for our purposes here. Well, so I want to test that hypothesis in both of these countries. In fact, in all these countries, I picked 5 just to give you an example. And so if it turns out that low socioeconomic status does predict to more support for political Islam in both of these countries, are we really testing the same hypothesis? Is it really support for political Islam that is our dependent variable? Well, yes, if we can demonstrate that they are conceptually equivalent, and so the identification of these bridging items is the way that I made my case. That yes, even though the items are often not the same, we have these bridging items that show that load highly on a factor in each of the countries. And so those factors, I mean, one could argue about this, but almost certainly, I think, are equivalent. I think we build a strong case for inferring validity equivalence. You don't really. Okay, so I'm kind of going on, and I'm a little conscious of the time. How we? I know we're not at the end yet, but
34 minutes. 34 minutes.
oh, okay. So you know, feel free to jump in with a question or a comment, or you use this technique as well, and you want to share that. I mean, just to, you know, feel free. Okay, so did a lot of work on attitudes toward democracy. Still an important question, but when we put the air barometer together, this was maybe a more salient question, something people were talking about a lot more. It was not right after the Arab Spring, but fairly soon after the Arab Spring. And so we asked people, we had this whole battery on attitude toward democracy. And we could have done a factor analysis and see if every one of those items belongs together. And maybe one of them wouldn't have belonged, so we would have had to remove it. And then we could have had an index or a factor score based on the remaining ones. But in this case, it took just one item. And that is, it's written here, isn't it? Yeah, okay. Democratic political systems may have problems, but democracy is still best. This is the fourth item in a whole battery. It's used in the World Value Survey and a lot of other surveys. And do you agree or do you disagree that democracy tends to promote divisions within a society, or democracies aren't really very effective at promoting development? So there are a bunch of questions about what democracy does or does not do for a society. And then come the question we're using, well, maybe whether or not there are problems, maybe there are problems, certainly there are some limitations, but problems notwithstanding, democracy is still the best political system. So we took just this one item, and it's partly because we're doing descriptive analysis. We want to really show what the distributions are in each country and in each wave. These are the first four waves. And I guess well, maybe the years not. The first one is 2006, second one is 2011, third one is 2013, the fourth one is 2016, and then we've done several since then, but they're not here. And I thought it's better to use a single item. If I simply put down the factor score and 3/10 of a standard deviation above the mean, that wouldn't be very. So for descriptive purposes, we're just using one item. But one of the questions that came up, still comes up, it came up particularly at the time, well, what about Islam? Is that anti-democratic? Are we being asked to choose between democracy, the so-called Western concept, and political Islam or Islamic governance, something that maybe the West doesn't have? And well, why don't we test that? We'll have a separate hypothesis. We'll see what the distribution of support for democracy is, and then we'll try to come up with some independent variables that account for that variance, so we can construct a causal story and we feel we've learned something. And then we'll do the same thing for political Islam. Well, yeah, we could do that. In fact, we did do that, but we also did something else, which is kind of obvious here, but it's the point I want to make. We went to a typology, and we thought we could probably get a better handle on what people think if we consider these two things in combination. If it's the case that that the two are really opposed, well, we probably won't get anybody that likes both. We'll get some people who like both of them, and some people who will like only democracy, and some who like only political Islam. But there won't be many people who like them both because they're in contradiction with one another. But in fact, that's not the case. And so we just constructed a very straightforward technology here. The numbers in the cells are the maxima and the minima among the different data sets, here, the different countries. And so the 46 for secular democracy, that's the lowest anybody got, and that's the percentage of Algerians who opted for secular democracy, meaning democracy yes, political Islam no. And the country where that was most appreciated and got the highest numbers, you're probably gonna find it more quickly than I am, but it's Tunisia, okay? And so instead of looking at the two variables separately, we can look at them in combination. And I think our hypothesis then become, and we can do both, of course, but I think the hypothesis become a little bit more interesting. What are the determinants of an attitude that says democracy is very important? Yeah, it's better than, despite its problems, it's better than any other system. But also like political Islam, who agree with the proposition that I think it's on here. Maybe I don't have the wording, but anyway, I know what it is. It's you know, to what extent do you agree strongly or disagree strongly that religious leaders should have influence over government decisions. And that one item, again, comes out of a battery that was factor analyzed. So we're doing some of the things we've been talking about here. But the argument here is that thinking about dependent variables in combination and coming up with typologies can actually be quite instructive. It gives you maybe a better sense of what people actually think. And then you have 4 cells, and you can have hypotheses that predict or that claim to predict whether you're in any one of the 4 categories or not in that one category. Okay, so typologies. So now we're coming to a survey experiment, and I'm looking around to see them in good time and so forth. This was the 4th wave of the air barometer, 2016, 2017. It was done in 5 countries. You see the countries there. It was done at a time when the Islamic State was probably at its apex in terms of influence of people paying attention to it. The question was, well, why are people leaving Tunisia, where a lot did, or Saudi Arabia, or someplace else, and joining the Islamic State? What do people think of the Islamic State? It's claiming to do a battle on behalf of Islam. So we took a look at the messaging of the Islamic State. What kinds of things are they saying in their messaging? And what kinds of things do we think we would like people to know about it? And these became treatments in an experiment, in a survey experiment. And you have the treatments here. The first one is just emerges as a potent force in the region. It declared a caliphate based in Syria, and it seeks to extend the caliphate across the Muslim world, and it prepared to and has killed many Muslims as well as non-Muslims to support its objective. So we're telling people, so there's a control group, of course, we're telling people, well, you know, maybe you think a caliphate across the Muslim world is a good idea, or maybe not. Maybe you think it's so important that even if people have to die to realize it, well, so be it. So there's that one, that's the first treatment. And then B, C, and D are repeating that first treatment again, but adding something else that the Islamic State has argued in its, or declared in its messaging, is part of its agenda. Is to reduce the influence of Shia, who aren't true Muslims, and Iran, or it is to reduce the importance of secular Arab leaders, like the ones we were telling jokes about a little while ago, or to reduce the influence of or eliminate secular Arab leaders who don't really represent their population and also don't represent Islam. So we're giving people choices. In principle, we would have thought that giving people this information, I mean, maybe their views are really solid, it wouldn't have made much of a difference, but that probably if we tell them what someone thinks Islamic State is doing, and if you happen to think, well, it's true, I live in a country where there is a secular leader, he's supported by the West, he's very authoritarian, he doesn't represent the people, there's poverty in our society, well, maybe you're going to have a better view of Islamic State. Well, I'm not crazy about them, but yeah, if they're fighting these secular, unrepresentative Arab leaders, then yeah, maybe I kind of support them and agree. Turns out that's not the case. And I'll go in the next slide to a little bit. We also tried to look at what was the distribution in different countries. We also did both a pooled analysis and a country-specific analysis that I'll come to in a couple minutes. And this is a publication if you happen to want to look into it a little bit more. But we also asked ourselves, are there certain categories of the population where views that might be more prepared to be receptive to Arab Islamic State messaging, and therefore will have better opinions, especially when we tell them some of these things. And we thought what we call the key demographic, men who are not very well educated, high school or less, and younger, under 35, I think, if I recall, this is the population from which the Islamic State hopes to do most of its recruiting. It does recruit women, and as a matter of fact, I'm directing an honors thesis. This is really interesting, and we're only at the beginning honors thesis of one of our students who has managed to get profiles, which has been looking all over, profiles of 70 women 74, I think it is, women who joined the Islamic State. And we have information about a lot of their attributes. Were they engaged in violence? How young were they when they went in? And we're trying to do a little bit of profiling and test some relationships. I think it's kind of, it's going to probably be pretty interesting. She's a very good student. But in any event, this key demographic, young, poorly educated men, is where we think the Islamic State targets its messaging with particular emphasis. And so I want to see the pattern overall, and then the pattern for this quote unquote key demographic. So here we are. You'll have to come up and see why I really can't see this. So we actually had more than these 3 questions, but the 3 questions that we used in this analysis. What do you think about their goals? What do you think about their methods or their tactics? And what do you think about the degree to which they are or are not respecting the teachings of Islam? And so we looked at the control group, and we looked at each, the impact of each treatment. And you can see the treatment pushes things down. To the extent it has any impact, it actually makes people more critical, or reduce the number of people who say something positive about the Islamic State is very small to begin with. But it's even smaller if you look at the people who have one of these treatments. So treatments are not making people a little bit more sympathetic because they kind of do like some of these goals. It's not doing that at all. It's making them less sympathetic. I also want to call attention to this not disagreed. First one is, first group is just a question about, what percentage agree to a large extent, or at least somewhat on our Likert scale, that the Islamic State goals are okay. Among people who didn't respond, the number is higher. We had a very lively debate within our group. So there was a fair number of people who didn't answer the question. One of my co-authors felt very strongly, and he made a good case, that there's a reason why they're not responding. They have a favorable view of the Islamic State, but they're not going to say it in public, so they're just going to say, I don't know, or they're just going to refuse to answer. So we can really attribute support for the Islamic State to these people. And so that's why it says not agree. So it's not just people who disagreed with the Islamic State messaging or whatever the treatment was, but also who didn't answer. We had and I was not in agreement with that position. And to support my argument, I said, but a lot of the people who said they don't know to this question, they said they don't know to a lot of other questions. We can't really assume this. So by chance, I was giving a presentation based on this project, which was in the works, it wasn't done yet, on the way to becoming the publication that it became. And so I presented this way, and I said, well, we're kind of unsure. Some of us think that maybe not answering or saying, I don't know, that maybe that's an indication of support. Well, everybody rose up. How could you say that? You're just making these attributions based on nothing. You could say they said anything. There's no evidence that that's what they thought. So I had to say, well, that would happen to be my position in our group. But in the paper, we do it both ways. So I mean, if you want to take the position that not responding does tell you something when it's a question like this, and you should take that into consideration. Well, even though it's not the position I find most convincing, it's plausible, and so you have the data. What it looks like if you do include those who didn't respond or said don't know. Here's the key demographic over here, and I mean you can see the numbers. They're small, and they're smaller when it's the case that when it's the case that that there's one of the treatment. I mean, it's small to begin with, and it goes down in almost every case. There are one or two exceptions here and there. In almost every case, telling people more about the Islamic State makes them even less. A certain percentage of those who otherwise would have supported them, if had they been in the control group, now that support falls away. Here are the findings for, and this is also pooled analysis. I guess, yeah, I have pooled analysis up there. That's a whole question about a lot of, a different combination of us published an article that we like very much in comparative political studies, and we submitted pooled analysis. And the reviews came back, this is a very good, this is a really interesting study. The data seem good, and we like it. But the pooled analysis, I mean, that's hiding too many, that's hiding too much. You can't really assume that your finding applies to every country. And so you're kind of, even though you might use some language that expresses a little bit of caution, you are basically telling us one of the reasons this finding is important, because it applies generally. We've got a national sample and it applies generally. Maybe it does, but we got to revise and resubmit, which actually made the article much better by the time it came out. And it was, you need to tell us, if you want us to go with the pooled analysis, you need to tell us in an appendix or somewhere that you have looked at that separately in every country. The finding holds up in every country. And so the pooled analysis really does tell you something that's generalizable. Well, we found in one country it didn't apply, and in another country it partially applied, but only for a certain subset of the population. So even though it's not on my list of things, just some pros and cons of pooled analysis I think is worth thinking about. Okay, here is the key demographic. Yes, for each country. And okay, at the top, we don't have the top one we haven't really brought the experiment in. So this is based on everybody, those who did get a treatment and those who were in the control group. That's meshing together people who have very different experience, so there's reason to be kind of cautious about that. We found in a number of different analyses that Palestine and Algeria were much higher than any place else, much more likely to be supportive. In Algeria, for example, 8.6% had a positive view of the goals of the Islamic State. And so we're wondering, oh, I think I said that wrong. So the red and the blue here compare our key demographic with those who are not in the key demographic. Everybody who is not a younger, less well-educated man. You can see that in general, surprisingly, the people who are in our key demographic, they're not any more likely to support the Islamic State, and they are often less likely, sort of counterintuitive. If you look at Palestine, 6.2% support and agree with the goals of the Islamic State. So it's nowhere near, it's not a huge number, but it's a fair number. And among those who are not younger, poorly educated men, those who are not members of the key demographic, the number who support the goals of the Islamic State is actually higher. And so this is all very descriptive. I mean, there's no real bivariate analysis or multivariate analysis here, but it does raise some questions about the key demographic, the group that we thought would be disproportionately likely to have positive views. Maybe not many would have them, but they still be more likely to have them than those who were not in the key demographic. In fact, that's not the case. The key demographic in many cases actually depresses the level of support. We should be cautious, as a matter of fact, because both treatment and non-treatment are all lumped in here, but this tells us something. Okay, the one at the bottom, and just to, I started to say that it's interesting that Palestine and Algeria are the places where support is higher, not very high, but high enough to be noticeable. And we had some discussions about, can we make any assumptions about what it is about Palestine and Algeria that separate them from the other countries? And there's some things that come to mind, but they're not things for which we have any evidence, so they're pure speculation. But it is interesting that, I mean, we see there's some variance there, and maybe we need to do some additional research to find out why that is the case. Okay, the one at the bottom is the one I really wanted to talk about. This shows the impact of the different treatments on members of this key demographic, those who are relatively poorly educated, younger, and male. The control group is kind of worrisome. Among this group, I mean, it's only one part of society, but it's an important part. 10% of the people have a positive view of the goals of ISIS, of the Islamic State's goals. And as we saw earlier, with each treatment, the percentage goes down. And there's some, and we can look at this country by country, and maybe in certain countries, the treatment that talks about, the Islamic State is going to oppose this bastardization of Islam, the Shia. Well, maybe I'm wandering a little bit here, but the point is, we had an experiment. We had some treatments that we thought were effective. The treatments did have an impact, but it wasn't the impact that we thought it would be. It was actually a different kind of impact. And if we look at just the control group, these are the people who didn't receive a treatment. They represent population untreated, and it shows us that kind of what the level of support is, and among this demographic, it's pretty high. Okay. Yeah, I think maybe I'm coming to, maybe this is the last one, which would be nice. So what does Islam say about women? And who can answer this question? So here's a bunch of public intellectuals, Islamic scholars who've weighed in on that question. And Maududi, as you probably know, or Said Qutb, these are women should be home. That's the only thing they should be. There's nothing more to be said about it. That's what Islam requires. Finished. Qaradawi, who is criticizing them, who's recently passed away, spiritual leader of the Ikhwan, of the Islamic Brotherhood, of the Muslim Brotherhood, says that in direct response to these very conservative positions, that's a misinterpretation of Islam. He himself is pretty conservative, but he sets himself apart from these very dogmatic statements that come out of, as I say, Said Qutb or Maududi. And then you have one I think I know best, who is Fatima Mernissi. You probably know who she is. She's recently passed away, somewhat recently, Moroccan sociologist, and says that, we only think Islam says that because we have men who live in the context of patriarchy telling us what Islam says. That's really not what Islam says at all. And we can look at a number of very specific provisions or a number of edicts and see that they tell a very different story. So there's debate among people who claim to be in a position to speak for Islam. I had one here for forgotten his name already, but who lives in Switzerland, and he's, Ramadan, yeah. So there's a lot of people who weigh in on this, and people can pick the ones that they find more congenial, or they can try to sort out, well, what do we do with all this? Well, I mean, if we're social scientists, this is variance. That's what we want. We want variance. And so we asked people a number of questions. And here's how we proceeded. After some pre-testing, we begin with a kind of general statement today, as in the past. Muslim scholars and jurists sometimes disagree about the proper interpretation of Islam in response to present-day issues. For each of the following, saying whether you agree strongly, whether you disagree strongly about the particular interpretation. Here are two questions. Now, that's followed by two questions that are about the status of women. There are other questions in the battery that I'm not presenting here about what about religious minorities? What about banks charging interest? What about democracy and nationalism as a concept? So there's a number of things. So here we've asked people, is it a violation in Islam for male and female university students to study, to attend classes together? You know, if you look at a place like Kuwait, 1 year it is, the next year it's not, the next year after that it is again. But we're asking people, so what do you think? Can men and women study together, or does Islam have something to say on that subject? And what it says is they should not. What about wearing the hijab? Is that a requirement? Or women should be modest, and wearing the hijab is fine. They should do it if they want, except if it's for political purposes, then they shouldn't do it if it's for political purposes. But Islam doesn't require it. Or no, come on, be honest. Islam does require it, and everybody understands that. So we're asking people what they think. We're combining the two items into an index ranging from, I'm not particularly satisfied with the terms, but from liberal to conservative. Liberal who would say Islam does not require the hijab. I strongly agree with that. And men and women can study together in classes. I strongly agree with that. Islam does not prevent it. And at the conservative, at the other end, the people who take a more conservative position on both of these. So this is work that I have started but put aside. There's other things keep coming up, but I think it will be interesting. And we'll also look at the questions about women's status with the other questions that are on this dimension about, as I said, religious minorities, democracy, banks, and nationalism. This is just a description, if you're interested, this is the last slide, of what the responses look like. Remember, it's a scale that goes from 2 to 8. The midpoint is 5.5. And here are 4 of the countries for each of the 4 waves. So for Jordan in wave 1, that was 2006. The mean score of everybody who answered that question on a scale that ranges from 2 more liberal to 8 more conservative, the average score was 4.7. And how much dispersion was that? Is that 4.7 represent that there were a lot who had 2s and a lot who had 7s and 8s, and this is just kind of an artificial mean? Or no, there's kind of a normal distribution. So the standard deviation tells us how spread out they were. And down at the bottom, just a little summary. So for Jordan, slightly below the midpoint toward the liberal pole, some dispersion, modest dispersion, not a lot, but some. And little variation across the 4 waves. Goes from low of 4.5 in wave 3 to a high of 4.9, but it's always a little bit below the midpoint. This is a very good foundation for doing some interesting multivariate analysis and formulating some propositions that hopefully would be persuasive and worth testing. In any event, that's kind of my list, and it's back to where I started at the very beginning. So just trying to take you through a number of things, a number of challenges that came up in the context of doing these surveys. Which items do you think? You have many. Well, I won't go through the list again, but this is the structure that has kind of guided me through this. So thank you very much for hanging in there.
Well, we have maybe a couple of minutes.
Oh, we have?
Yeah, just a couple of minutes, I think, yeah. So is there a quick question? I don't think on the Q and A there was a question. Is there a quick question here? Stephen, yes.
So, I will admit that this question.
And maybe just say,
for-
just say who you are for.
Yeah,
for the-
my name is Stephen Gasteyer. I'm here in the Department of Sociology. Most of my work is in Palestine.
Oh, good, okay.
I started thinking about this when you were looking at the Daesh support in Palestine. And since you have waves, what would be the possibility of doing something like an event history? Right, so you have waves, so you could look at the support over time and see how it correlates with upticks in Israeli violence against Palestinians, for instance.
I think that would be really worth doing. Probably the air barometer, since it's just once every 2 or 3 years, isn't gonna give you enough, won't capture enough variance for you then to see whether you can link it to certain events going on. There's just not enough. But there are places where you can go into more detail there. You probably know Khalil Shikaki, and so they do surveys all the time. And they're our air barometer partner, and Khalil is someone who I've known for a long, long time. I think something like that would be worth doing, and probably you could get a grant for that, I bet you. You pick a different time period, and also, I mean, as long as we're just kind of ruminating, it could, and this is something I'm trying to do in a different study. It could be variation over across space as well. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be over time, this year versus that year, but Jenin versus Ramallah versus Tulkarm, and but I think and Khalil's done some of this in terms of support for armed struggle, or what the Israelis would call terrorism, and sometimes it really is terrorism, but sometimes it's just armed struggle, and not in an ongoing systematic way, but linking either settler violence or IDF incursions to the ups and downs of support for armed struggle.
I can just, one of the things that I thought about is that I did my Fulbright there, 2015, 2016, and you could actually gauge, just taking my taxi back and forth from Ramallah to Beersheba, you could gauge the support for Daesh that would come in, and invariably after there was a significant IDF incursion violence against Palestinians, you'd see the black flags come out, and then they disappear. Right, they would last about a week and then they disappear.
What was the year you were there? 2018, you said?
2015, 16.
Oh, so really the height of this.
Yeah, it was a hot year. Yeah.
Where were you? Where was your host institution?
I was at Beersheba.
Oh, okay. Yeah. We had a collaboration with Najah. That's where I first met Khalil.
Oh,
At the time, he was a professor at Najah. He was a professor at Najah who didn't have papers to work and was holed up in his in-laws' house without any ability to do anything. So they sent him to us in the States, and we got to know each other early on.
Well, we are out of time. I want to give a very special thank you to Professor Mark Tessler. So please join me in thanking him. At this point, I'd like to invite you all to join us for dinner right across the hall. And for those of you who are joining us online, thank you so much. I wish that I could teleport the food to you as well, but in any case, thank you everyone. It's been a wonderful conference. I want to thank especially Professor Russell Lucas and Professor Camille Suleiman and Mary Ferdowsi and everyone who was involved in this. So thank you so much. And of course, our moderators, Ani Sarkisian, Azita Najavoti, Amina Everett, and our faculty here. We have Stephen Gasteyer, one of our faculty members here. So, and Jisna Singh as well. So please, thank you everyone, and please join us for dinner. Thank you.